Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College, coming to you with a little presentation on emerging adulthood. And so, first of all, we have to figure out just what do we mean by emerging adulthood. This would be considered sort of the transitional time between adolescence and adulthood. Now, different from previous generations where you had some event that marked your passage from child to adult, things like maybe a quinceañera, where you were then considered an adult. Today, we don't have so much of that. Um, so, movement from adolescence to adulthood is more a transitional process rather than a one time event. So as people begin taking on more adult responsibilities and begin to become more independent, then we have this transitional period that we call emerging adulthood. Now, for simplicity, we generally are looking at, roughly age 18 through 25 for most people. So let's bring up an outline to work with, and that'll help guide us through this. Let me get my pointer as well. Sorry that I have to pause to do this. I haven't figured out a way to make it as smooth as I'd like. Here we go. We should have that. There we go. Okay, so let's look at some of the issues related to biology first. So first of all, in terms of health, emerging adulthood is pretty much the healthiest portion of the lifespan. Many of the childhood problems that one might have with health, things like allergies or asthma, often those will improve by the time you get into emerging adulthood. Childhood illnesses that are more common tend not to be any more existing. And things that hit people later in adulthood usually haven't begun to emerge. Things like cancer and heart disease, not very common in emerging adulthood. So we also would say that physically speaking, people are pretty much in the prime of their life here. So in terms of athletic ability, work capacity, generally highest during emerging adulthood. Emerging adults also have greater organ reserve than other age groups. What that means is excess capacity. So in terms of um, lung volume or heart stroke capacity, uh, they have a greater reserve of this. So what that means is the emerging adult, even if they're not working out all the time, usually can, say, play a game of pickup basketball with their friends without being too gassed from it and without being too stiff and sore for days afterwards. Whereas an older adult would, first of all, maybe not be able to even do that if they're not working out regularly. And secondly, might really have some more significant after effects. Now, the fact that one has considerable organ reserve also means that emerging adults can sort of get away with some bad health habits and so forth. So they can maybe go out for a night of heavy drinking and still kind of function pretty well the next day. That might wipe out an older adult for a much longer period of time. They might be able to eat poorly and not really notice much of an effect, whereas an older adult would immediately notice this having an effect. So there's kind of an upside to this. There's also the downside that for some emerging adults, they may engage in not the best health habits. In terms of sexual and reproductive ability, we're going to find that emerging adults are more fertile, have more frequent orgasms, fewer miscarriages than other age groups. They rarely encounter serious birth complications. So, of any time in the lifespan, emerging adults are best suited to childbirth. In terms of attitudes towards sexual activity, today emerging adults are generally okay with premarital sexual activity amongst consenting adults. Majority would say that that's not morally wrong. This differs from previous generations who would be more likely to see that as being wrong. One thing that hasn't changed is emerging adults today do still see extramarital sex as being wrong. That would be a person who is married having sex with someone other than their partner, their spouse. In the thinking of emerging adults today, there has been a greater disconnect between sexual activity and childbirth due to the invention of very effective contraception. So, what that means is that um, emerging adults today, if they have access to that contraception, are less likely to think of the implications of sexual activity in terms of becoming pregnant. Also, there has been a disconnect between attitudes towards sex and marriage. So, um, most emerging adults today do not see marriage as a prerequisite for sexual activity. The sexual transmitted infections, STIs, are more common today in emerging adults than previously. And one of the reasons may be that those attitudes towards sex, emerging adults today may engage in premarital sex more often and be exposed to those more frequently. So, one of the problems is that, again, emerging adults having been exposed to sexually transmitted infections may not take steps to get that checked out and have it treated. Part of the problem is the availability of health care for emerging adults. We also see that emerging adults do often deal with risk-taking impulses. Of course, we see that most prominently with adolescents, teenagers, but there is still a tendency to engage in risky behavior through emerging adulthood, although the reasons may differ. In adolescence, it might be a matter of showing off, impressing others. In emerging adulthood, where risk-taking impulses occur often, it's more a matter of seeking out some um, stimulation, something exciting for the thrill of it. And so you see amongst emerging adults, numerous emerging adults engaging in some extreme sports like, mountain climbing, rock climbing, race car driving, that kind of stuff. Now, some of this also shows up in some even riskier sorts of behaviors like having unprotected sex with someone that you don't know very well, or abusing drugs, engaging in gambling, or maybe careless gun handling. So, interestingly, that all kind of plays into what are the major causes of death amongst emerging adults. Major causes of death: number one, accidents, injuries. Number two, homicides. So, being the victim of a violent crime is number two. And number three, suicide. Those are the three biggest killers of emerging adults. Notice that these also are somewhat preventable. Okay. Sometimes risky behavior results in accidents, injuries. Sometimes taking risks, being sort of in a place that's not very safe, with people that aren't very safe, um, or maybe engaging in confrontations might lead to homicides. Suicides may be somewhat preventable, particularly uh, in the potential of the person reaching out for help rather than keeping suicidal thoughts in or others intervening to help them. So, major causes of death, somewhat preventable. In terms of drug use in emerging adulthood, we will see that things like binge drinking still fairly common. Interestingly, they noted that there are higher rates of drug use in residential colleges. In other words, colleges where people live on campus or very close to campus, higher rates of drug use there. Community college is where people generally live at home, off campus. They found lower rates of drug use. What we also see is over the course of emerging adulthood, the abuse of alcohol and illegal drugs does decline. So that begins to taper off as people get into their 20s and their mid 20s. So next, let's look at cognitive development, development of thinking and processing information. So here, Piaget, his final stage of cognitive development was the development of formal thought, the ability to engage in hypothetical and abstract thinking, which occurred in adolescence. More recent research suggests that there is an additional development that we might call post-formal thought occurring during emerging adulthood. And this post-formal thinking then would be exemplified by a number of things. Thinking that is more practical, more flexible, and more dialectical than adolescent thought. So, more practical. The adolescent might think about all kinds of abstract ideas that really couldn't even be put into practice. Whereas the emerging adult is going to say, I'm not going to spend my time thinking about these hypothetical things that can't really happen anyway. Also, post-formal thought, more flexible than adolescent thinking. So adolescents, once they've adopted a opinion of something, often they become quite fixed in that opinion. Whereas emerging adults, they might form an opinion of something, and when presented new evidence, they will more readily change their opinion based on new information. Also, post-formal thought is more dialectical as well than adolescent thinking. In other words, the emerging adult can look at opposing information and integrate that, work with that opposing information. Or they can integrate, for example, subjective and objective thinking. So subjective thinking, this is based on your personal experience and your personal feelings. So this is feelings, personal experience. They can integrate that with objective information. So information that comes from research, scientific research, observations that have been made systematically. They can work these two things together and take them both into account. Whereas the adolescent will tend to gravitate towards one or the other and not be able to put the information together from personal experience as well as outside information. And so the emerging adult then also can integrate emotions with reasoning more readily. So here's a case in point. When thinking about a potential vocation to go into, the adolescent can take into account their emotions. They can also take into account information about that vocation, you know, how much money you make, how available are jobs, how much training does it take. But they again will tend to make decisions about that based on either their feelings or on reasoning. They have difficulty putting the two together. In emerging adulthood, though, the person can more readily do that. So they can take into account the objective information about a vocation that they're thinking of getting into. You know, what's it pay? What kind of training do you have to do? And, you know, how likely am I to get a job and so forth. And they can integrate that with their feelings as, would I like that kind of work? Would I like the kind of environment that that's a part of? They can put that together to make a better decision. So this ability to engage in dialectical thought benefits them. One of the things that emerging adults may deal with as they um, engage in college or a new vocation is dealing with stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is a fear that you're going to be judged negatively by others, um, and that judgment is going to be based on some perceived prejudice. So people are going to have prejudiced ideas about me, and they're going to judge me. The problem with this sort of feeling is that when you're afraid of this, you don't think as clearly. You can't do your best. So stereotype threat may interfere with the success in college or the success vocationally of emerging adults, particularly those who are part of various minority groups. Now, when we look at then college, what we will find is research on college graduates found they were more likely to achieve a higher income overall, especially over many years, and better health than those who are non-college graduates. So when people who are sort of guiding society looked at this, they said, well, if we're going to increase incomes and improve health, then let's get everybody to go to college. And that's going to make society a better place. So this resulted in the massification of college education, college for everybody, that idea. So as a result, it became easier for students to get loans to go to college. It became easier to be admitted to college. So more people in emerging adulthood now attend college than ever before. When we look at the demographics, the population patterns of college students today, more college students are female than in the past. Also, more people of ethnic and racial minorities are attending college than ever before. That all's a good thing. When we look at this, then the next question is college really delivering what it traditionally was thought to do? So traditionally, college was thought to be for the purpose of helping people improve their ability to think clearly. So William Perry years ago observed some patterns in thinking that occurred as students attended college. Here it is. So they found that students began with sort of a dualistic thinking pattern. So they wanted to know, well, what are the right or wrong answers that my professor wants me to give? But as they had more experience in college, they became more relativistic in their thinking. And rather than thinking of things as black or white, right or wrong answer, there was the realization that, well, there are some things that are relative. They're not as simple as black or white, right or wrong. There's nuance, there's shades of reality to various things. And so there could be then now various interpretations could have some value. So not one value was the right answer, but maybe a number of different ways might be valuable in thinking about things. What they saw then further as students became even more um, experienced, backing up to the relativistic view, this for some students also becomes quite confusing because as they looked at it, well, there's numerous different viewpoints that have some value. Which viewpoint am I going to take? And so that led to further development of finally, as students became more experienced, committing to one's personal perspective. So sorting through the various interpretations of things and deciding just what am I going to buy into. And even while doing that, he found that students even then would see the value of other perspectives, but would say, well, this is how I think about it. So there's an advance in thinking here from simple black and white thinking to personal perspectives that he found. Still seems to apply today. Now, that said, more recent studies of college-related advances in thinking would suggest that there has been some slowing of advances in recent years as compared to the past. What they found is a college education improved students' critical thinking today less so than it did years ago. They also found that college students today were less proficient in reading comprehension, problem solving, and particularly mathematical ability as compared to college students years ago. And so you might be thinking, well, why is that? I think in part it's because the purpose of college has changed, at least how people think about it. Again, it used to be that college was to develop your ability to think well. And these sort of skills that we just mentioned, critical thinking, problem solving, reading proficiency, comprehension, and so on, that was why people went to college. But is that why people go to college now, to improve their thinking? No, mostly people go to college now because what? It'll help me get a better job, it'll help me earn more money, take better care of my family, and so forth. There has been a shift in the purpose of college. And as that shift has occurred in how people think about college, so has the way that college courses are taught. So critical thinking, problem solving, not as much emphasized. And they also found that students would tend to today look for the professors that it might take somewhat less effort. So the emphasis nowadays, not so much on how much can I learn, how much can I develop, but rather how can I, with maybe less effort, obtain that diploma that's going to be my ticket to get to something better. So, kind of goes along with how people think about college. Okay, now what we also know is that today, in many college environments, students are exposed to a very diverse student body. People of many different ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, and so forth that they might not otherwise encounter if they didn't attend college. So the results of that diversity on thinking is that people have become more accepting of those who are different from themselves. So that's been a positive outcome. Now, one thing that the textbook doesn't pick up, they talk a lot about the effects of college on emerging adults. They don't talk about what about the emerging adults who don't go to college. And I looked it up, and it's something like 40% of emerging adults do not attend college. So just want to say a bit about that. So what are those who are not attending college during this time period? What are they doing? Well, some of them go directly into work, working at jobs that don't require a lot of training, or maybe working at a job that you can get some very basic vocational training and do okay in. Some of them may form their own business. Some of them may take time out to start a family, although that's a little bit less common now than it used to be. And some of those people are maybe in prison, okay, or engaging in some not legal activity. And then we have some individuals who are basically doing none of these things and seem to be just trying to drift through emerging adulthood. So those who are not doing some of the things like working or starting a business, starting a family, uh, some of these other people who are in prison or not doing any of these things may be having some significant personal problems like substance abuse problems, mental or emotional problems, so forth. But I thought that was significant. Yeah, 40% of people not attending college. So a lot of people are taking some time to work or do some other things first. Okay, so let's move on then to psychological and social development. And so there are two very important challenges that emerging adults deal with. For many emerging adults, it's continuing to form their sense of identity. We'll also see in a bit that issues regarding intimacy are also challenges for emerging adults, but let's focus on identity. So you might remember Erickson's identity versus role diffusion that he saw adolescents dealing with. Well, today we see a lot of emerging adults still dealing with those issues of who am I, what sort of ideas and beliefs, attitudes am I going to develop, what goals will I have in life, what vocation. So a few of these areas of identity in particular come up for many emerging adults. One would be issues of ethnic identity. And so to what extent will one follow in the footsteps of their parents and grandparents in terms of ethnic practices? To what extent am I going to make an issue of my ethnic identity and put that forward as an important part about myself? That is something. What they also found was really interesting, I think, is that in adolescence, people might think of their ethnic identity as Hispanic or Asian, Black, whatever, but they tend to want to become more specific about it as they get into emerging adulthood. So maybe rather than thinking of oneself as Latino or Hispanic now, maybe it's Mexican American, Cuban American, and very specific elements of that ethnic identity might become more important. The second part of identity that many emerging adults continue to deal with would be a vocational identity. So that's pretty hard to nail down in adolescence, as we saw earlier. And for that reason, many emerging adults will have a series of temporary and short-term jobs during emerging adulthood. Some studies suggest probably an average of 7 of these temporary short-term jobs during emerging adulthood. We also see this in terms of college majors. Many emerging adults have difficulty picking a major. They're not quite sure what they want to do. Now, in many cases, what they will finally do is choose one best as they can, but still have in the back of their mind, I'm going to go to college for that degree. I'm going to try to get into that vocation. I'll see how it goes. And then once I'm out there doing that, I'll decide if that's what I want to continue or whether I want to make a change. So what we also then see are the personality development. Many emerging adults who had problems with, say, shyness or aggressive behavior, anxiety, or self-doubt as adolescents begin to overcome these difficulties as they get into emerging adulthood. So self-esteem, sense of well-being for majority of emerging adults rises. Why is that? Well, as they successfully go through the transitions of emerging adulthood, this raises self-esteem and that sense of well-being. As the emerging adult has success in relationships, as a friend, as a lover, as a parent, these improve. When they make successful transitions, leaving home, graduating from college, securing their first real job, those kind of things, again, these provide a boost to self-esteem and one's sense of well-being. So for the majority of emerging adults, there are improvements in these areas. So next we want to look at where there are some significant problems that develop in terms of mental or emotional disorders. So one of our first questions about that is going to be, well, why is it that these things may emerge for the first time in this emerging adulthood period? So one of the answers to that would be to have a look at the diathesis stress model, or stress diathesis model, however you want to put it. Okay, so what's that mean? Okay, well, a diathesis is a sort of genetic vulnerability, something that you're susceptible to. You know what stress is, okay? So the diathesis stress model suggests that what? Diathesis, genetic vulnerabilities, interact with a stressful environment to trigger then mental and emotional disorders in some people. So this involves a vulnerability in some area that one has inherited that is triggered then by environmental factors or life events. So what are some of them that may be significant in emerging adulthood? Mood disorders. So what we see is that before age 30, we have numerous emerging adults experience mood disorders, primarily depression. Okay, so in fact, what we find is in emerging adulthood, we have the highest incidence and cumulative prevalence of depression of any age group. So what we have is between age 18 to 25, 25% of emerging adults have experienced depression or are currently experiencing that. Pretty high number, highest of the entire lifespan. So, what things then seem to contribute to the development of depression in emerging adulthood? One would be lack of supportive relationships. So, that emerging adult who is isolated, doesn't have friends, doesn't have supportive family, does not have supportive relationships with others at work or at school, more likely to develop this. We also see that again, attribution patterns, thinking patterns about why things go wrong come into play. Particularly, again, attributions that involve problems seen as being permanent, as being personal, in other words, that one blames oneself for the problem, and being um, pervasive, that one sees the problem as ruining their entire life rather than being just in one area. We also know that rumination plays a part. So the emerging adult who dwells on problems and continues to constantly um, put their focus on problems rather than solutions or what good things that they might have. Also, when emerging adults have difficulty adapting to the demands of emerging adulthood, where they fail at moving forward to become more independent, or they fail in their attempts to, say, leave home, move out on their own, develop friends, complete their education, uh, get a job. Wherever there are failures in this area, that may also contribute to the development of depression. What you should also know is many emerging adults who suffer from this do not get treatment. They may be unaware that there's effective treatments, or maybe they might fear that the treatments would be more damaging than the problem, medications and so forth. Or they may simply not have access due to lack of health care or lack of mental health care. Um, so, in that said, some are simply not aware that they're really having a problem with this, particularly if they've withdrawn and they're isolated. They may not uh, have others that tell them that, hey, this is not normal. So, obviously, making people aware what are the signs of depression is going to be important so that they can reach out, get some help, and also making that treatment more readily available as well is going to be important for actually treating this problem. Secondly, we also see that there is an increase in anxiety disorders in this age group. So what we find is about 1 in 4 of emerging adults have experienced an anxiety disorder. Now, this could include things like social anxiety, where one has a dread fear of looking foolish in front of others, which might really bring on problems if you've got to do a job interview or if you have to do a class presentation in a college class. Generalized anxiety disorder, which involves kind of a constant worry, a constant apprehension that something terrible is going to happen, or panic disorder, where one experiences panic attacks, brief periods of time where one experiences maybe sheer terror. This might be accompanied by frightening thoughts like one is going to die or one's going crazy. Might be accompanied also by scary physical symptoms, shaking, feeling as if they can't get your breath, heart racing, sweating, all of those kinds of things. Pretty scary stuff. Um, Also, uh, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, diagnostically, this is now classified a little bit differently than anxiety disorders, but there's an anxiety component to it. This would be a fear and avoidance of situations similar to the trauma that one has experienced. Also, obsessive compulsive disorder, again, now thought of as not particular an anxiety disorder, but there's an anxiety component to it as well. Anxiety in some area like constant anxiety, fears of contamination, and then compulsive behaviors in order to reduce that anxiety that are only effective for brief periods of time. So, what leads to the development of anxiety disorders in this age group? Well, obviously, genetic vulnerability plays a part. Also, pressure to succeed, having to deal with many changes in a short period of time, lack of social support, and in some cases, traumatic experiences all can contribute to developing these anxiety disorders. Once again, helpful treatment is available, but many emerging adults don't necessarily access that treatment or are unable to do so. And then finally, we have schizophrenia, another psychological disorder that, if it appears, is most likely to develop at this point in the lifespan as opposed to others. So, what is schizophrenia? Well, we'd say this is a severe psychological disorder, may involve things like what? Delusions, false ideas, such as paranoia that someone is plotting to harm you when there's no evidence of that. Hallucinations, so false sensory experiences, disordered thinking, bizarre thoughts, bizarre behavior, disordered speech. Speech doesn't make any sense to anyone else. A lack of motivation to do even normal things, even maybe dressing or bathing. Social withdrawal, often part of that. So, wide range of symptoms, but obviously quite severe. So, what we see as diagnosis of schizophrenia peaks in emerging adulthood around age 21. When it comes to schizophrenia, there are treatments that majority of individuals with schizophrenia benefit from, antipsychotic medications being the primary one. So once again, this is one that would require very significant attention. Okay, so let's move on to then the second developmental challenge in emerging adulthood, that being intimacy versus isolation. Okay, so hang on here. I'm gonna take a break here. Okay, let's see, and resuming here. Sorry about the interruption. Here we go. And let's see, let me get a pointer here again for you. Okay. All right, now there we go. So first of all, intimacy is defined as a close, enduring relationship with another person. This is a relationship where there is commitment towards the other person. Um, Sometimes self-sacrifice becomes part of that as well, willingness to sacrifice one with another, and a deep connection, emotional connection with that person. Intimacy also involves sharing deeply about oneself and having numerous experiences with that person. So there are a variety of ways that needs for intimacy can be achieved. That might be through romantic relationships, might be through friendships, it might be through very close friends, acquaintances. The emerging adult then has an urge to form these intimate relationships, at least one of them. And if they are unable to do so, they will suffer from a sense of isolation. And they'll wonder what's wrong with them. Why are they alone? That's going to be very difficult for them. So there's a strong urge to develop these type of relationships. So one of the ways of finding someone to share their life with would be through marriage. So that's the avenue that many emerging adults will choose. We'll talk about some of the alternatives in a minute. Now, interestingly, if we look at the selection of marriage partners, there's basically three patterns worldwide. So you have some societies like ours where the person pretty much is free to choose whoever they want as a marriage partner. There might be some input from family and friends, but it's mostly just suggestive. A second pattern would be the arranged marriage. And so in this case, the person's family or some other entity decides who that person is going to marry. And the individual has really not much of a choice in it. Believe it or not, that still occurs in significant part of the world today. Third pattern is where people's marriage partner is only from a limited group. So there's only a particular group that they can choose from, and this is then done with a great deal of input from family. And so here it's not free choice per se, it's limited choice in that the family must approve and it must be from that approved group. So what we actually see is in 2/3 of the world today, people do not freely choose marriage partners. It's not just open to anyone. So we're actually in the minority of having pretty much free choice of marriage partners. So one of the things that has changed in terms of finding a partner, whether that be for marriage or other, is the development of social networking, the internet. And so, interestingly, in my generation, yeah, how did you find someone for a romantic partner, marriage partner, and so on? Well, you met them somewhere, whether it was where you went to school or where you worked, or maybe at some social event that you attended, whatever, a dance or whatever. Um, Today, there's the internet. And so we see all kinds of dating sites on the internet, and people are actually using those to identify intimate partners, sometimes temporary, though. One of the funny things that they found is the availability of so many choices actually leads some people into a choice overload. There's so many potential people that they could try to date that they finally just give up. Thought that was kind of interesting. So, an alternative to marriage as a way to meet needs for intimacy is cohabitation. Cohabitation today is more common than in the past and is uh, really becoming as common as marriage in the United States. The reasons that people engage in cohabitation, they may see it as a way of having an intimate relationship with another person, without a long-term commitment. They may see it as a way of having that relationship while still saving some money as well. Many, though, do see it still as a prelude to marriage. They think that in the end, this may result in marriage, but they're not ready to make that commitment at that time. Some people enter into cohabitation as a test of compatibility. Would that person be suitable as marriage partner? So a variety of reasons we're seeing this, more common than in the past. So in terms of effects, some of the more negative effects that they told us even 10 years ago seem to be less pronounced now. 10 years ago, we would have said higher rates of domestic violence, higher rates of drug abuse. That has become less prominent amongst people that cohabit than it used to be. So not as much that, but we do see some significant differences. One being couples that cohabit before they marry are more likely to divorce than those that do not cohabit before marrying. And I thought that was a really interesting one. I'll run that by you again because it always throws people off. They said, what? Yes, so couples that cohabit before they marry more likely to divorce than those that do not cohabit before they marry. I say, well, why is that? Okay, I'll give you a couple of the reasons that seem to hold up as to why that statistic occurs. First of all, when couples cohabit, usually what they will do is they will kind of keep their financial things as separate rather than combining their financial resources. So they tend to continue that separate financial situation as if they marry. And so this can lead to conflict about money, even more so than you might typically have in marriage. The second reason that this seemed to underlie this is think about this. Okay, if you're cohabiting with someone and you see they have some problems, you might say, well, gosh, maybe they'll change. I'm already here with them. I'm not going to back out on things. I'm already here. It's harder to leave than if you are not cohabiting with that person. If you are in a relationship with a person, you don't cohabit with them, you see they've got some problems or they're not for you, it's a lot easier to just say, bye-bye, I'm done with you, and that's it. And so that doesn't go forward in marriage. Those that are cohabiting may be more likely to continue on with the relationship, enter in marriage with a person that has some significant problems or is really not suitable for them. So I think that's the other reason for that surprising outcome. Whereas most people feel that they're going to work the bugs out of things and find out if that person is compatible, may not really work. That may be more of an illusion than reality. Second thing wanted to point out is that generally speaking, the children of couples that cohabit do less well socially as well as academically than those of married couples for some variety of reasons. But so that should give some pause to those that are considering cohabitation. There can be some downsides to that. Okay, not saying that every family, that couple that cohabits is going to have these problems, but there are some things to think about before considering that. Okay, now let's look at the family connections of emerging adults. We can say that they still are linked with their families for the most part. And so linked lives, the connection between that emerging adult today may be more important than for previous generations. So why? Well, today, fewer emerging adults have established their own family. Fewer of them have secure, high-paying jobs. Fewer of them have a solid identity, solid goals. It takes longer nowadays to come up with these things for many people. And so that may mean having a strong connection with their family benefits. So what we find is for most emerging adults, each generation of the family is linked to them and influences each other. One of the ways that this can show up is that frequently parents may assist that emerging adult with help for college tuition or a place to live, maybe some cash occasionally when it's needed, or help obtaining medical care, food, help with tasks, including maybe childcare, so that family connection can really be a lifeline for a lot of emerging adults. Now, the flip side of that, some emerging adults who lack family support may find it hard to meet the challenges of emerging adulthood, including college completion. So family still important for emerging adults. Okay, so there you have it. That's what I wanted to go over with you about the topic. Do make sure you've read the textbook as well, and we'll call it quits here. So there you go.